to the 49th Annual Common Ground Country Fair. The Common Ground Country Fair is hosted by the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, also known as MOFGA. My name is Sarah Alexander, and I'm the Executive Director of MOFGA. Thank you. Formed in 1971, we work year-round to transform our food system by supporting our farmers, empowering people to feed their communities, and advocating for an organic future. This has been a particularly challenging year for our farmers, starting with federal funding and program cuts, and leading into a very wet spring, followed by most of the state being in a drought over the last couple of months. MOFGA is here to support our farmers, but we need your support to stay strong through the USDA funding cuts. We encourage you to visit the MOFGA tent right over here on the green to learn more, and you can become a MOFGA member right here at the fair or make a donation online at mofga.org. On this beautiful sunny day, we're excited to share that MOFGA and the fair are entirely powered by the sun. We have a 102 kilowatt solar array right here on the grounds that was installed in 2017 with our partner Revision Energy, and it works year round to provide all of the electricity that we need for the fair and everything else we do. MOFGA's campus is 300 acres situated on unceded Wabanaki homelands. MOFGA's working year-round to support Wabanaki food sovereignty projects and advocate for Wabanaki tribal sovereignty. We encourage everyone to visit the Wabanaki Arts Tent, which is right over here on the Commons, to support Wabanaki artisans and learn more. And I'm really honored today to introduce our speaker. Our keynote speaker is Tony Sutton. He's an assistant professor at the University of Maine in Native American Programs and Cooperative Extension and a faculty fellow at the Mitchell Center. As a joint appointment in Native American Programs and Cooperative Extension, Tony supports food sovereignty for Wabanaki communities. This includes developing classes about indigenous knowledge and foodways, advising students engaging with tribal communities, and developing programming and technical assistance for community food programs. Tony's research connects history and indigenous research methods to inform collaborative contexts and critical attention to policy that shapes fisheries and food sovereignty in ways inconsistent with Wabanaki foodways. Tony is also on the planning team for the Wabanaki Commission for Land and Stewardship. The mission for the commission is to facilitate creating access to ancestral homeland territory to support land-based cultural practices while also creating formal processes for reacquiring ancestral territory. The planning team's role is to create the commission as a nonprofit and centering priorities for each tribal nation. This includes outreach to other indigenous conservation groups, creating access protocols between Wabanaki people and conservation groups, land transactions, and maintaining educational resources. Prior to moving to his current position, Tony worked on the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, a collaboration that he maintains through his current position at the University of Maine. On this project, he engaged tribal nations, clammers, municipalities, research institutions, and state agencies to support the needs and future vision of the soft-shell clam fishery. His work included completing interviews with a diverse range of voices in the industry to develop a work plan, develop policy documents that identify barriers to Wabanaki clammers, and reintegrating Wabanaki perspectives, knowledge, and values into the Mudflat website, technical documents, and through a newsletter that has a coast-wide audience of shellfish harvesters. Please join me in welcoming Tony Sutton.
All right, thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone for coming here and choosing to spend some time here. I mean, you didn't have to do that, but I really appreciate it. Usually I like to speak extemporaneously because I've got like a PowerPoint because I'm an academic and I'm a nerd, but I don't have that. So today I'm going to be speaking in the rhetorical style, which is I've written notes that are being intended to be read. So just to start, it's always an honor to come here and speak at the Common Ground Fair. I remember when I first came here, I was just I was blown away by the food. And we really do have the best food here in this region. And if I spent some time talking to each one of these food producers, I'm sure that they have their own story, but I can't tell their story. And I wanted to spend some time today sharing the story of Wabanaki food sovereignty. To be clear, some people reject that term altogether, and we'll get into why, but a better question is, why am I talking about food sovereignty? I'm not a fisher or a food producer. I'm just somebody who likes to eat and who's discovered their identity through food. So when Maine first passed the food sovereignty legislation, one of my mentors, Ed Bassett, posed the question, what does this mean for fisheries or for the estuaries that are cared for and cultivated to support Passamaquoddy food sovereignty? A question like that doesn't get immediate answers. It's complex. But I want to use this space to start a conversation. So while we may not arrive at answers, it's still going to give us a direction forward. And the first place I'd like to start is doing some conceptual work. And some people might reduce that to semantics, but how we define concepts matters because it shapes policy, funding calls, and eventually how people relate to the land and water, and how that land and water is shaped by those relations. As Dr. Seema Eben states, knowledge is power, but those who exert control over definitions of knowledge, including how it is constituted, validated, and which cognitive tools are salient, possess an even greater source of power. One of the ways this transpires in Maine is through the term sustenance. And I always use my water bottle as an example because I always have one. But from the state of Maine's perspective, sustenance for us means if I grabbed this fish out of the Unity stream with my bare hands, because that's how I fish, and I put it on my table for my family, that's sustenance. And what it does is reduces that to a very simple practice and avoids a lot of the complex ways we use to express food. This also occurs within food sovereignty broadly, as Dr. Raj Patel states, if we talk about food sovereignty, we talk about rights. And if we do that, we must talk about ways to ensure those rights are met across a range of geographies by everyone in substantive and meaningful ways. And I spend a lot of time thinking about fisheries, and one of the ways this idea comes up is that it's not just about food on the table, it's about management processes. As Dr. Carrie Norgard states, speaking to indigenous food out west, diet change, rather than being inevitable, was tied to ecosystem decline. That was in turn a function of the improper management of the rivers and forests by federal and state agencies. Returning to sustenance, remember it's defined as food on the table, not care for the land and waters. That's why context matters. So let's look a little bit more about this story here in Maine. As one exercise I do in my class, I have students look at Maine's food sovereignty legislation and identify concepts and see how communities are putting those concepts into action. So similarly, I've identified 3 areas from that legislation to shape my talk today. The first one, small-scale farming and food production. Ensure family farms and traditional foodways. Improve health and well-being, specifically by reducing hunger and increasing food security. And the last one, local control, and it's primarily focused on food production and distributing that within communities. Now, usually when I talk about food, I'm often asked to speak about specific food places. So to look at these terms, I've organized this talk about the water around the watershed we're currently standing in. So we can actually start our conversation right here. We can move down the Sebasticook, talk more about food sovereignty there, and then finally we can take the Kennebec down into the saltwater and think about food sovereignty in that place. So we'll use these 3 areas to think about these concepts. So this keynote will not just be a conversation, but it's going to be integrated through old travel routes, stories, knowledge, and the histories attached to them. So let's start here with farming. For longer than Maine was even an idea, this has been a farming area, but it may not have had that word for it. Maine's food sovereignty legislation centers family farms and traditional foodway, though whose notion of traditional are we using? If we're going to go real tradish, we would start with our creation stories, the stories that not only teach us skills, but the values and knowledge needed for caretaking. To summarize the origin of corn story that comes from Maliseet homeland, corn is introduced to the community from a matriarch. In our culture, matriarchs were and are the leaders, especially related to food. In the story, when she introduces corn, she also introduces the use of fire as a technique to sustain the practice over time. Or as she states, if you want to have me with you always, meaning corn, you will follow my instructions. These notions of sustainability have been here for a long time, and other Wabanaki engage in these practices too. James Francis notes that fire was used not just for agriculture, but for the care of the woods, encouraging berries, ground nuts, and not to mention the numerous game species that thrive because of the clearing of the underbrush, which also produced healthy populations of hardwood trees, which we'll come back to. From this perspective, traditional means caretaking and also not forcing the land to a specific type of crop, but using care to encourage a robust and healthy landscape. And I also want to elaborate on landscape a little bit too, because I don't mean an individual growing everything that they need, but places connected across vast geographies where food is cultivated, fish and game are harvested, and our plant relatives are gathered. Since we've already learned about the caretaking of corn, these are ideas that even extend into fish. As Carol Dana shares in Transformer Tales, a Penobscot story about how to build a fish weir, and this practice is also connected to caretaking, because as the fish weir was originally built across the entire river, it blocked all the fish, and the grandmother warned, how will future generations live if you take all the fish? So then the weir was rebuilt to only one section of the river, so that way fish passage could occur. And caring for the land and water is a pattern we see today with farming, if you call it that, the caretaking of rivers, and also our plant relatives. As Dr. Suzanne Greenlaw states, Wabanaki sweetgrass harvesters and their knowledge employ ethics, accountability, and reciprocity. They hold obligations and responsibilities to tribal communities, the sweetgrass community, to the salt marsh, and to sweetgrass. They are the best land managers. From this perspective, traditional elaborates on caretaking through accessing more than cultivated foods to plants, medicines, game, fish, and all the numerous relatives across Wabanaki homelands. For food sovereignty legislation, small-scale traditional farming is centered, though it's not centered as Wabanaki as traditional, and in many cases, traditional wasn't our option. Historically, food growing was overseen by Indian agents, state-appointed officials that dictated internal processes like growing food, which centered stationary food systems where excess is sold to market. As one Indian agent described in Sabayak, to the many disadvantages under which they labored, the loose, idle, vagrant habits that have been instilled upon them from their cradles, it is a certainly encouraging feature to see so many of them beginning to show so much readiness and desire to improve in farming. Of the many wrong things with this quote, it reflects the reality of the time that people didn't care or acknowledge the deep, complex knowledge of our food systems, and also that they forced upon a Eurocentric approach to food production that is inconsistent with the teachings of the land. In this example, Sabayak wasn't chosen for agriculture, it was chosen for access to porpoise. And when I hear Micah Pauling talk about the Passamaquoddy petitions advocating for Sabayak, they were advocating for porpoise almost like they were talking about food security. And this Indian agent, not being familiar with this, again, forces a particular way of relating to the land, or in this case, traditional foodways. I share these instances so we can celebrate the work that's happening today and also know where the growth can occur. To celebrate first, today we can trace Abenaki flintcorn in our homelands being grown again, being processed by Wabanaki people again, and being distributed by Wabanaki people to homes and even utilized by Wabanaki chefs. And we can also know why some of these people reject being identified as a farmer. And now we can understand that given these histories, how policy continues to shape how people relate to the land. As one example, I saw an infrastructure call recently that specifically excluded wild harvest. And I'm sure they had reasons to do so, but for the purpose of this talk, when you exclude things like fiddleheads or other wild foods and medicines, you're limiting the expressions of what food means. Furthermore, access or movement to wild foods can be inhibited by boundaries like municipal governments, federal, state, or public lands. In many ways, the policy system is still set up to support traditional foodways. This is what Patel is advocating for. And when we open up that space, we have to consider other topics too, such as to grow that magic corn that ends up in corn minis, you need to access fish for fertilizer, and that's where I'd like to go next. So from here, we can take Unity Stream up to Unity Pond, and Unity Stream is just behind the parking lot, in case you were wondering. From there, we can take what's called the 20-mile stream into the Sebasticook. I'm not sure this is the correct traditional travel route or not, but it's one way we could get there through our river highways. And you can experience this too if you go to the Molten Mills Preserve. But from there, we can use the Sebasticook and its connections to the Kennebec to inform how we think about fish and also movement. In another traditional story shared by Carol Dana, movement is a key feature of rivers. As it's told, Gulskop, who is a trickster character, traveled the rivers, and where there were blockages, they cleared them. And I love this part where it says, and then they also cleared the portages. From this perspective, Gulskop is ensuring movement for the fish first, and then also people second. And these stories typically don't get credit for having complex forms of knowledge because, again, pre-contact people were still super smart. But the Sebasticook demonstrates this knowledge with one of the largest pre-contact fish weirs. And weirs are just a form of trap fishing, in case you're wondering. They're used in both intertidal and rivers, but both require complex knowledge of how water circulates for them to be effective. As Micah Pauling states, again, movement is not just about travel, it's about a movement between knowledge systems. Returning to corn briefly, it's the movement between those places and the knowledge systems that makes growing and distributing corn possible today. Though Maine's food sovereignty legislation isn't particularly good at dealing with movement or fish, but they're essential. If we move down the Sebasticook to the Kennebec just a little bit, we can learn more about fish and food. If we reduce fish to numbers for just a moment, Harper and Ranco in an EPA Lifeways report indicate around 30 to 40% of calories historically came from sea-run fish, the fish that are migrating into our rivers. But that doesn't get to the complexity. Along the Kennebec, Molly Obamswin describes this region as, for millennia, the Kennebec River was the nucleus of Wabanaki food systems, diplomacy, and ceremonial life. I love that word, the nucleus, because it's not just the grocery store, it's the Hannaford Distribution Center, a complex system of transportation that connected Wabanaki communities across large distances, giving us strength. This is our form of food security. An indigenous economy that centers the caretaking of the land and waters first and then shares that abundance with our families and relatives in distant places. This is why Gulskop cleared the rivers, and this is why caretaking in those places is so essential to sustain all those rhythms. Though it was the management of the forests, lands, and fish that also organized colonization. Fish were described as limitless, and the hardwoods like white pine organized colonial land theft. And just to speak to trees for the moment, it was unsustainable forestry practices that were driving exploration so that pine could be used for things like ship masts and everyday products like barrels. But it was the strength and movement of food systems that resisted colonization. In fact, the British had so much difficulty fighting the Wabanaki that they were pushed as far back as modern-day Kittery and forced into signing treaties. And I still don't know what gets lost in translation, but the British still felt they had a claim to Wabanaki territories. And against treaty rights, they started building forts in our Hannaford distribution centers to disrupt our movement and access to food. And one of those, Fort Halifax, was at the confluence of the Kennebec and Sebasticook rivers in what is now called Winslow. And if you visit there, the park describes this history as Native Americans, and I just love that because we don't even know who they are. Native Americans lived here for 5,000 years, then a pilgrim trading post was here, and then a fort. Lost in the telling of that is the purpose of this fort, to disconnect from the fisheries in this location, the rich soils that we're standing in, and also movement. And this has both immediate and lasting impacts, especially for considering the food sovereignty legislation, which is considering the health and well-being of communities through food security. Historically, health and well-being for non-Indigenous communities has been through economics. And if you go to Fort Halifax today, you can see this pattern. It's the presence of dams occupying food locations. Because once these forts removed Wabanaki people, they developed them to support non-Indigenous economics, which impacted the health and well-being of fish. As one example, by the mid-1800s, only 2 salmon were caught in the lower portion of the Kennebec River. Non-Indigenous economics was always the justification, from textile mills to sawmills to later paper mills. The clearing of the land and literally hundreds of dams spread across all major river systems. And all of these industries used the rivers as their waste system, which contributed to the decline in habitat and the abundance in fisheries once cared for by Wabanaki. Not to mention the upstream flooding impacting food places too by all these dams. Like, as one example, in the early 1900s, the state of Maine seized, which is a nice way to say stole, Passamaquoddy land to sell to the St. Croix Paper Company, which also had permission to build a dam and flood upstream Passamaquoddy territory. Now, this pattern is not the same for all land theft, but by the time the Settlement Act came around, it was found that 2/3 of land was appropriated in some way. And at the same time, it was when terms like sustenance are articulated and when the municipal distinction for tribal governments occurred. And that Settlement Act is a good way to kind of transition back into today's context. And since we're in the Sebasticook and talking about fish, I want to talk about 2 ideas related to the municipal distinction, which is key in Maine's food sovereignty legislation. The Maine Municipal Association describes municipal management as the purest form of democracy, which has existed in some way since the creation of Maine. And a defining feature of that is home rule, which came about in 1969, which allows municipal governments to adopt or amend ordinances without legislative authorization. Now, this allows communities to do some interesting work, like the greater Portland area collaborated with surrounding municipalities to solve water pollution issues. And perhaps more central to this area, PFAS, or those forever chemicals contamination, started bubbling up in around 2015 to 2019, was really prominent in the news. And what's surprising to me was how fast the state legislature responded to support communities, with passing 7 bills in 2021 alone related to PFAS contamination. And again, what astonishes me here is that there's not a similar sense of urgency for Indigenous issues within this space. Like my wife says, there's been drinking water issues in Sabayak my whole life, or the fact that our food has been polluted for a long time. Kind of like health and well-being, there's inconsistent application of these ideas. And one statistic that supports that is the Harvard report on the Settlement Act that notes that this municipal distinction has not only hurt Wabanaki communities economically, but the state of Maine as a whole. Now, the last aspect of the municipal distinction I want to discuss is how land-centric it is. Now, what do I mean by that? You probably experience this when you drive around Maine. You can go into X town, you're driving into Ellsworth. It says, "Welcome to Ellsworth," and then you drive for miles before you even see anything, and then all of a sudden there's a town. But when you go to reservations, they tend to be these tiny little tracts of land. This distinction matters. To return to corn, harvesting herring is relatively accessible, but I would say there's probably because there's not a huge industry organized around it at the moment. But related to land, in 1974, the Maine legislature and newly formed DMR started leasing herring rights to municipal governments. And these municipal governments tend to be coastal municipalities in close relation to rivers. And what this means in practice is that you don't have control over access to fishing locations. You're giving individual fishing quotas, and if you partake in the caretaking of rivers to restore fish populations, you don't have a say in how those rights are allocated. This restricted ability to exercise rights happens because of the land dispossession we just discussed, and the arising policy and management structures that were created in our absence. And the last aspect I want to elaborate on is related to the municipal governance relationship and clams. But to do that, we need to go to the saltwater first. So how we get there from there is moving down the Kennebec, we go into the Merrymeeting Bay. From there, we can either cross the Androscoggin and Portage to the saltwater, or we can go down to the Kennebec and travel to other areas of the coast. In a state with over 3,400 miles of coastline, Wabanaki people maintain a fraction of a percentage of that. And we know why from the previous section. Though our connection to these places is still there. As a story left by Zipsis and my grandmother, everywhere you go there are Indian paths to follow. Everywhere, even under the macadam, the concrete, the aqueduct, there are easy trails to find food, water, and shelter. The trails grown deep with the pounding of feet. Similarly, I find myself walking Indian paths along the coast looking for clams just like her. But it's in places where the policy currently allows us. And one of my interests in the saltwater is so many of our food relatives come from these special places. Again, just to reduce it to numbers for a moment, andronymus and marine fish, shellfish, marine mammals constituted 40% of the calories while we lived along the coast. That's like removing the meat, dairy, produce, and bakery sections from the grocery store. Though we only look at these kind of numbers in times of market disruption. Like during the Great Depression, late Passamaquoddy elder David Francis said that people in Eastport were starving, but in Sabayat they lived well because of the abundance the saltwater provided. And there are even stories of the grandmothers taking their biggest boiling pots and using them to catch pollock near the shore. Though today it's almost the opposite. While Sabayat still does have access to the saltwater, even our namesake, the people who spear pollock, cannot be done. This is why I'm so interested in clams, and no talk of mine would be complete without a lengthy discussion on clams. But one of our traditional stories even tells us it was dogs who introduced us to clams to give us this nourishment. Since so many of our freshwater relatives are polluted, I see a return to the saltwater and clams specifically as a modern equivalent of giving us that nourishment. In one of my first attempts at a cultural program, and what I mean by that is like I'm an academic, so I think we do an okay job of working with Indigenous people and being interested in Indigenous knowledge. There's not a great emphasis on how we produce new knowledge holders. Like that term knowledge holder, it means there's a scarcity. When I'm doing a cultural programming, I'm trying to share that knowledge so it's not a scarcity. So back to our story. In my first cultural program, I wanted to take some Wabanaki youth to a non-reservation area to learn about clamming. And knowing the policies, I contacted the local town office to talk about my idea. And I was immediately shut down. No non-residents can dig clams here. Now, why is that? In short, the management system privileges large land holdings, so when you look at the state as a whole, and that 3,400 miles of coast, and Wabanaki people maintaining less than a fraction of a percentage of that, that percentage matters. And the long answer starts shortly after the Great Depression. The clam fishery had already existed, but it was about the 1950s where municipal authority was given to towns. And despite no treaties giving up rights to accessing these relatives, what it does is it creates the conditions where communities can say, these are our clams. This is local control, just in a different context. Now, it's highly productive for non-Indigenous clammers, and at the same time, it's the mechanism for removing our access, because as town develops their ordinances and shellfish committees, now they can enforce resident rules that were the block to that first program. But there's some opportunities here. One of the things I love about clams, specifically soft-shell clams, is they have this unique way of resisting colonial structures. And again, municipal management derives from colonial structures. So in my dissertation, I spoke with Passamaquoddy fishers, and one of the impacts to near-shore fisheries, they said, was unsustainable fishing practices. Like for one, soft-shell clams, they don't travel well, so they resist this structure that wants to ship them to where they're most profitable. And two, they also break down boundaries that exist in management systems. In some of my previous work with the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, one of our colleagues, Dr. Gabby Hillier, worked with supporting shellfish communities doing water quality projects. And this requires you to look at the whole watershed. And one thing that came up was how many people working in regards to water throughout the watershed hadn't even met yet. And at the same time, it was the health of clams that brought people together to fix this problem. In a recent article titled by Monique Coombs, titled "Clean Water Starts with the Land," This title accurately represents this issue about how upstream pollution is responsible for closing flats, creating economic uncertainties for those living along the coast. In many ways, clams break down those boundaries and encourage more collective action. One of the ways that supports my work is that municipal ordinances are relatively flexible, and working directly with towns can support clam gathering activities that we do today. Though some people may critique that broader systems change is needed, and they're right, I'm just always inspired by a non-Indigenous clammer who said, anything that gets people out on the mud is a good thing. And he was speaking in relation to management, but for me, it becomes a way to walk those Indian paths again, connect with our ancestors, and when we do that, our forms of care can come back too. So, to close, going forward, I just wanted to take a few minutes to also think about, well, like, what does all this stuff mean? So to start briefly, non-Indigenous people always ask like what they can do or how they can learn about Wabanaki food. And I say, like, don't overthink it, just grow something. Soon is actually a good time to start planting garlic, and then it's going to be ready in the spring. And now you're starting to think about food seasonally. And then after you're done, you're going to need something to care for the soil. So try growing some beans to restore the nutrients. And don't forget to share with your neighbors, because food sharing collectively gives us strength. You can also go and learn about the river herring migrations. When I participate in alewife gatherings, the restoration efforts aren't defined by political boundaries or job titles. It's people coming together to do the work. It's community. But that's not to say there's not tension, because remember, within fisheries, they have these are our fish or our clams kind of position. But let's just start with reconnecting to fish and the land. So grow something. Even historically, it was patriotic to have a garden when structures fail. And when structures fail, it's our local food producers and fishers that fill the gaps. Instead of being the fallback, let's recenter that to being more common. One of my goals with Wabanaki communities is making our traditional foods not special anymore. And what I mean by that, instead of having like a traditional meal once or less a month, perhaps it's once a week, and we keep building on that. And you can do the same thing from food from this region. There's sayings like Meatless Monday. What about Maine Food Monday or Wabanaki Food Wednesdays? You know, our food is beautiful. So we should honor that by caring for the land and water and sharing that with those who can't access it so they can partake in the beauty too. And before I close, I want to return to my mentor, Ed, and think about what does food sovereignty mean for fisheries? For one, if we're going to do the work of food sovereignty seriously, we need to recognize the rights that are allowed and the ones that aren't. And when I was thinking about it, perhaps that first thing, restoring that relationship to food, is part of that. Because the fisheries restoration work that's occurring across all those major river systems is restoring a food system. But right now it needs care and it needs rest. When we look at fisheries broadly in Maine, over 90% of that is exported. So perhaps while it rests, we can think about ways that that food can feed our communities. Someone once asked me like how I would redesign the seafood distribution system. And I said, it's too powerful for me to do that, but I can choose not to participate in it. Like when I coordinate clam gathering activities, it reconnects people to each other, the traditions around clamming, the coast, and when you reconnect with clams, it means we have to consider the whole watershed and the lands around it. And I want to elaborate on that a little bit too. Because we need to recognize while municipal boundaries can be productive, it's also dependent upon the land and waters around those boundaries. Returning to clean water starts with the land, much like how this article describes the impact of clam closures. That's also the experience of the Passamaquoddy Bay as upstream contaminants affect, as Ed calls it, the restoration of aquatic gardens. We now know that while these are both water pollution problems, that there are historically different responses or abilities to exercise local control that shapes how we respond to these issues. At the same time, recentering Wabanaki issues tends to have more holistic benefits. Just in terms of alewives, I told this story about in Sabayak, when the fish weir closed, they went around and put a fish in everybody's mailbox. And I was sharing this story in a non-Indigenous community. And this guy laughed, and I said, "Why is that funny?" And he said, "Well, here we just hung them on our clotheslines." And I love these stories because they illustrate that traditional foodways have always included fish. And for indigenous and non-indigenous, they also spoke to it in a way that was food secure. Now for my last point, if we return to the term sustenance, none of the ideas that we talk